Our house used to feel like a living memory. Every creak in the floorboards, every photograph on the wall told a story of the people who built it. Grandpa George used to say that walls remember laughter, and that ours were the happiest he'd ever known. But lately those walls felt different, tense, heavy, listening to the sharp edge in Dad's voice and the silence that followed after every argument. Grandpa had lived with us for as long as I could remember. He was quiet, gentle, and always humming old tunes from the radio. He loved his garden. Rows of roses and tomatoes lined the backyard like children he tended with care. When I was little, he taught me how to grow things, how to talk to the earth so it talks back. But things began to change after Dad got his promotion last year. He started walking differently, speaking louder, like the world finally owed him respect. He looked at Grandpa not with gratitude, but with impatience, as if the old man's presence somehow dimmed his shine. "Dad," he would mutter over breakfast, "you could at least chip in for the bills. You've been retired for years. Do you think we're running a charity?" Grandpa would smile kindly, never answering back. He'd just pour his tea and say, "I've contributed enough to this home in my time, son." That answer always made Dad clench his jaw and leave the table early. Mom stayed quiet through it all. She'd glance between them, trapped between husband and father-in-law, her eyes full of worry. She once whispered to me when Dad wasn't around, "Your father just feels pressured. He doesn't mean what he says." But the bitterness in his tone said otherwise. The final blow came one evening after dinner. It had been a long day, the kind where everyone wanted silence. But silence is fragile, and Dad's anger shattered it easily. He stood in the living room, waving a stack of unpaid bills in his hand. "Do you think this place runs on magic, old man? You eat here, live here, use electricity, and do nothing. You should pay rent like everyone else." Mom gasped. I froze at the top of the stairs. Grandpa, sitting in his armchair, looked up slowly, his eyes calm, almost tired. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "I didn't know family charged each other rent, son," he said quietly. "But if that's what you want..." Dad cut him off, shouting louder, "Either pay or get out. I'm done carrying you." For a moment no one breathed. The air was thick, heavy with something that felt like finality. Grandpa studied him for a long time, then stood up, straightening his back despite his age. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead he smiled, a small knowing smile that reached his eyes. "All right," he said softly. "I'll get out." Then he walked upstairs slowly but steadily, and closed the door to his room. I remember the sound of that door. Not a slam, not a creak, but a quiet closing like the end of a chapter. The next morning his room was empty. His few belongings were gone. The garden gate swung open in the breeze, his hat hanging on the post. Dad acted triumphant for a few days, bragging that he had finally taken charge. But every night after that, the house grew quieter. The air felt colder, the walls emptier. Grandpa's laughter was gone, and no one played the radio anymore. And though none of us knew it then, that smile he gave before leaving wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of a lesson my father would never forget. The house felt different without Grandpa. Not immediately, at first it was just little things. The missing smell of his morning tea, the absence of his gentle whistling from the garden. But over time the silence grew thick enough to hear. Every empty chair, every quiet corner reminded us of the man who had once filled them. Dad didn't seem to care. He strutted around the house as if he had finally restored order. "It's about time he learned to stand on his own," he said to Mom one evening, leaning back in his chair with a beer in his hand. "We're not a retirement home." Mom didn't reply. She just looked down at her plate and pushed her food around quietly. There was something hollow in her eyes, a mix of guilt and fear. She missed Grandpa too, I could tell, but she'd grown used to swallowing her feelings to keep the peace. I tried to go about my days like nothing had changed, but the emptiness was loud. I'd catch myself glancing at the window, expecting to see Grandpa tending his roses. I even went to the garden a few times trying to water them like he used to. But somehow the plants seemed to know he was gone. The petals drooped, the soil turned dry. It was as if the house itself was mourning. A few weeks passed before the first crack appeared in Dad's victory. It came in the form of a white envelope, dropped through the mail slot one chilly morning. I I remember it because Dad never usually checked the mail, but that day he did. He tore the envelope open carelessly, glancing at the papers inside. Then his face changed. His confident smirk faded into confusion. His eyes darted across the page again and again, as if trying to make sense of what he was reading. Mom looked up from the kitchen. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the letter, his hands trembling. Then he muttered, "This has to be a mistake." I watched him from the hallway as he grabbed his phone and dialed a number printed on the paper. He spoke in short, tense bursts, pacing back and forth. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time it ended, his face had gone completely pale. "What's wrong?" Mom asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad looked up, his lips trembling. "The house," he said slowly. "It wasn't ours." The words hung in the air, sharp and unreal. I didn't understand at first. Mom frowned. "What do you mean, not ours? We've lived here for years." He swallowed hard. "The title. The deed. It's in Dad's name. It always has been." His voice cracked on the last word, as though it burned to say it aloud. "And he sold it." Mom's hand flew to her mouth. "Sold? What are you talking about?" Dad threw the papers on the table, a real estate confirmation stamped with the words, "Property sale finalized. $900,000 received. Seller George Martin." The room went completely still. The old man he'd shouted at, humiliated and driven out, the man he'd accused of freeloading, had been the owner of the house all along. I felt a strange mixture of awe and heartbreak. Grandpa had never said a word about owning the house. Maybe he didn't want power over anyone. Maybe he just wanted peace. Dad collapsed into a chair, his pride dissolving into panic. "He can't do this," he whispered. "He can't just sell it out from under us." But he could. And he had. That night, Dad made dozens of calls. To the realtor, to the county office, to anyone who might undo what had been done. Each answer was the same. The sale was legal, binding, and complete. Grandpa hadn't just walked away. He had taken the ground beneath Dad's arrogance with him. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's smile. That quiet, knowing smile the day he left. It wasn't defeat. It was a promise. And now that promise had been delivered. For the next few days, the house that once felt like a victory now felt like a ticking clock. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to echo one dreadful truth. We didn't own it anymore. Dad barely slept. He was constantly on his phone, calling lawyers, agents, even city officials. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and hear his voice coming from the living room, low, tense, desperate. He'd be sitting in his chair, a mess of papers spread across the table, mumbling to himself, "There has to be a way. There has to be something." But there wasn't. Grandpa had been meticulous. The property transfer was done, the payment had cleared, and the records had already been updated. The old man had made sure there were no loose ends. Mom tried to calm Dad down, but he was unraveling. The confident, proud man who had once ruled the house with an iron tongue was now pacing like a trapped animal. His voice, once booming and certain, had turned hollow. "I can't believe this," he muttered over and over. "I told him to pay rent, and he sold my house instead." Mom sighed softly. "It was never your house, James," she said. "You just never asked." That one sentence silenced him. He didn't reply. He just stared out the window where Grandpa's garden used to bloom, now brown and lifeless. By the third day, the eviction notice arrived. The new owners wanted the property vacated within 30 days. Dad's hand shook as he read it. He looked like a man watching his whole life collapse brick by brick. That evening, he finally did something I never thought I'd see. He called Grandpa. He sat on the edge of the couch, phone pressed tightly against his ear, his other hand trembling. For a few seconds, he just stared at the screen before pressing call. The line rang twice before Grandpa's calm, steady voice answered. "Hello." There was silence. Dad swallowed hard. "Dad, it's me." Grandpa didn't say anything right away. You could almost feel the stillness on the other end, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, Grandpa replied, "I know who it is, James. What can I do for you?" Dad's voice cracked, the arrogance stripped away. "Why did you do it?" he asked. You sold the house, our home. You left us with nothing. Grandpa chuckled softly, not out of mockery, but with the kind of sadness that comes from deep disappointment. Our home, he repeated. You told me to pay rent or get out. So I got out. And I took my home with me. Dad's breath hitched. Dad, please, he said, his voice breaking. You've made your point. But you can't just leave us like this. You know we have nowhere to go. There was a pause. Then Grandpa said quietly, You left me long before I left that house, James. The day you forgot respect, you stopped being my son, and I stopped being your burden. Tears welled in Dad's eyes. I'd never seen him cry before. Not once in my life. His voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't mean it, Dad. I was angry. I know, Grandpa said softly. But words spoken in anger build walls you can't climb back over. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only breathing filled the silence. Then Grandpa's tone softened even more. I didn't sell the house for revenge, James. I sold it for peace. I needed to let go of a place that stopped feeling like home. Dad tried one last time, his voice trembling. Please, Dad, what am I supposed to do now? Grandpa sighed deeply, the sound full of years and lessons. Learn what home really means, he said. It's not something you own. It's something you build with kindness. Maybe someday you'll understand. Then the line went dead. Dad sat there, phone still in his hand, tears streaming silently down his face. The man who once shouted to be heard was now drowned in the echo of his own silence. And for the first time I didn't feel pity. I felt truth. The next few weeks passed in a blur of boxes and goodbyes. The house that had once been our world was no longer ours to keep. Strangers came to measure the walls, to inspect the roof, to discuss renovations in voices too loud for a place still full of memories. Every word felt like another nail sealing our departure. Dad barely spoke anymore. He'd stopped shouting, stopped blaming, stopped pretending. His shoulders, once proud and squared, now hung low. It was as if the fight had drained right out of him. Mom tried to hold everything together, finding a rental house, sorting through furniture, but I could see the exhaustion written across her face. When we finally moved out, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. I touched the walls, the door frames, the faded marks on the kitchen table where Grandpa used to play cards. The silence was heavy, but beneath it, I could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, forgiving. Outside, the garden was still there, though withered and dry. I knelt beside one of the rose bushes and whispered, He didn't forget you, Grandpa. He just needed to start over. The wind carried my words away like a promise. A few days after we settled into our small rental apartment on the other side of town, a letter arrived. It was addressed not to Dad or Mom, but to me. The handwriting was unmistakable, Grandpa's neat, looping script, careful and slow. My heart pounded as I opened it. Asterisk, my dear. I know things must feel confusing right now. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Especially you. But sometimes, lessons only take root in the silence after the storm. Your father had forgotten what family meant, and I couldn't teach him by staying. Enclosed is a key. It opens a small cottage by Miller's Lake. It's quiet there, peaceful. I bought it years ago after your grandmother passed, but I rarely went. Now it belongs to you. Remember this, my child. A home is not made of wood or money. It's made of warmth, honesty, and love. When you're ready, come visit me there. The door will always be open. With all my heart. Grandpa. Asterisk. I read the letter 3 times before I could move. The words shimmered with kindness, not revenge. Even after everything, Grandpa's love had found its way through the cracks of betrayal. When I showed the letter to Mom, she cried quietly, pressing her hand to her mouth. Dad didn't say anything, but I saw the guilt flicker in his eyes, raw and real. That evening he went outside alone. Through the window, I watched him stand under the pale glow of the streetlight, staring up at the sky as if trying to find the words he never said. A week later, I took a bus out to Miller's Lake. The air was crisp, and the water shimmered like glass. At the edge of the path stood a little white cottage, framed by pine trees and wildflowers. Smoke curled from the chimney. I hesitated for a moment, then walked up the steps and turned the key. The door creaked open to the smell of old wood and tea. There he was, Grandpa, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, a book in his lap and that same calm smile on his face. I was wondering when you'd come, he said softly. I ran to him, tears blurring my vision. "You're not mad," I whispered. He chuckled. "Mad? No. Life's too short for anger. I only wanted to remind your father what truly matters. Sometimes, losing what you think you own is the only way to learn what you've taken for granted." We spent the afternoon talking about the house, the garden, the memories. And as the sun dipped below the lake, painting the sky gold, Grandpa looked at me with gentle eyes. "Someday," he said, "you'll build your own home. When you do, fill it with kindness, not pride. Promise me that." "I promise," I said, my voice trembling. That night, as I watched the sunset over the still waters, I finally understood what Grandpa meant. Revenge hadn't been his goal. It was a lesson cloaked in love, a final act of grace. And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the lake, I realized something simple and profound. Grandpa hadn't just sold a house. He'd rebuilt the meaning of family, one heart at a time.